So after the War of 1812, the United States went through about 4 years of nationalism, when Americans talked about doing what's best for the country as a whole, and gave you examples of economic, political, judicial, and diplomatic nationalism. Again, Americans spoke about the nation doing what's best for the country rather than for just their state, just their region, just their economic interests, or just them as individuals. In all of U.S. history, we have had very few periods of nationalism because the United States is just so big and so diverse. And the periods we have had nationalism, it just doesn't last very long. And the same was true with this one. It lasted about 4 years, and then this period of nationalism came to an end for 3 reasons. The first being the Panic of 1819. This is the first economic collapse in U.S. history under the new Constitution. You do not have to memorize what caused this, but this was caused, I'm going to explain it just so you understand, economic collapses, they follow a pattern. Famous book, This Time is Different, 8 Centuries of Financial Folly. Every time people insist this time is different, and they have a lot of similarities. So in 1819, what happened was the United States was doing fantastically well because Europe was still recovering from the Napoleonic Wars. So Europe had been destroyed, which means Europe is buying all of America's goods. So farmers in the United States were doing fantastically well. Prices for farm goods were really high. So a speculative bubble began to grow. Speculative bubbles are when people start investing a lot of money into things that they can't afford because prices are really high. And prices grow and grow and grow. And it is based on the assumption that prices are going to keep going up. So in the 1800s, this usually involved land. In the later 1800s, it'll involve the stock market. But the speculative bubble started growing. And you can see speculative bubbles because it is economic growth that is just so big, it does not make sense. It's not a scientific definition for it, but it is. You can look at the numbers and see, oh, this economic growth is not natural. And that's what was happening. Farmers were getting loans to buy more and more land so they could grow more and more crops because they're assuming they're going to be paid a lot of money. So farmers are going to the bank to get these loans, and banks popped up all throughout the country and were giving out loans. That is one group that was leading to the bubble. The other group were speculators. Speculators are people that have no interest in farming. They just want to buy the land and then sell it off to other people. So speculators are buying up big properties and leasing them out to other people. And so these speculators are dependent on the farmers paying them so they can pay the bank for these huge plots of land. So land is being bought up, and a key feature of economic collapses is banks. Banks making bad loans because there's a bubble. And it's with the assumption this bubble is going to keep growing. And so there's all these little banks giving out loans, and all these little banks were getting loans from the Second Bank of the United States, the institution that was just created. Second Bank of the United States, it was not acting responsibly. It was giving out loans to smaller banks that it should not have been giving out. And so this bubble from 1815 just kept growing and growing and growing. And then in 1819, the most horrible thing happened. Long-term peace and stability in Europe. When Europe recovered from its disasters and Europeans stopped fighting, all of a sudden European farmers were able to grow more, and so they didn't need American goods. So they stopped buying American goods. all of a sudden, the price that all the farmers were counting on to stay high started to drop. So the price for cotton, for grain, and everything started to drop. So you were an average farmer, and the numbers are totally arbitrary, but you're getting like 10 cents a pound for cotton, and then you keep doing the same thing, but all of a sudden, the price you're getting for cotton goes from 10 cents down to 2 cents. There's nothing you can do about it. The price of the market is what the price of the market's going to be. But all of a sudden, all these farmers couldn't pay their debt. So farmers were being foreclosed on by banks, and banks were taking their property. Those speculators, they couldn't pay, so they're getting all their land taken away. Even the small banks themselves were going bankrupt, because there was banks all over that had popped up. So they were going bankrupt, and all their assets, all their property was being taken up by the Second Bank of the United States. The Second Bank of the United States, it ended up being the second largest landowner in the country behind the United States government. So the Panic of 1819, again, nationalism, it can only happen if the economy is good. When the economy goes down, then all of a sudden, when people are economically desperate, they naturally start looking out for their own interest. So the Panic of 1819 was the first factor in destroying nationalism. It had two things that are important about it. First, it ended nationalism because, again, people were hurting. Farmers, of course, being good Americans, they didn't look inward and say, how did I fail? They blamed the Second Bank of the United States. A lot of people, especially out in the western half of the United States, that had been getting up these huge pieces of property, they blamed the Second Bank of the United States. And Second Bank of the United States is located in Philadelphia. So Westerners and Southerners, they blamed the Northeast. So there was economic sectionalism, where regions of the country, the West and the South, should blame the Northeast for this because that's where the banks were, in the Northeast. So Panic of 1819 led to economic sectionalism, and Southern and Western farmers blaming the Northeast. Second significance. This is the first economic collapse in U.S. history where there was a collective experience by Americans of a phenomenon that was unheard of. If you remember the previous lecture, we had just entered what's called the market revolution, which the economy had become more advanced. Now, when you get a more advanced economy, it gets more complicated. And so, whenever in subsistence farmers, it didn't matter what's happening in Europe. Well, it did a little bit, not much. But when you have a market-based economy, a more advanced economic system, all of a sudden, farmers, in Western Ohio were having their lands foreclosed on because of something that's happening all the way over in Europe. As the economy gets more advanced, it gets more complicated, and then individuals have much less control of their own circumstances. And that's a concept that, to this day, Americans hate. They hate that idea. But as economic systems get more advanced, it doesn't matter how hardworking these farmers were. They were being affected by something they had absolutely no control of, which is the price of their agricultural products. And again, this is the first economic collapse, but since then, obviously, our economy has gotten so much more complicated that today, the only way you can tell for sure if someone doesn't know what they're talking about when it comes to economics is if they engage in what's called the monocausal fallacy. That means they say one thing is responsible for some economic situation. It's not how the economy works. The most common one you hear is like presidents are responsible for oil prices. I don't care which president it is. I don't care which party it is. Presidents have no control over oil prices and gas prices, and they never have in the United States. Panic of 1819 will be the first big factor in ending nationalism in the United States.